The last vote was read aloud by a clerk no one remembered the name of. Species after species, station after station, each one casting the same word into the record: containment. The chamber of the Galactic Conclave seated representatives of 41 civilizations, and 39 of them voted to seal the Drahari home system and leave whatever survived inside to manage on its own. The plague had already taken 9 out of 10. The math, Arbiter Voss explained, was not cruel. It was simply correct. Counselor Dex Harrow sat at the small, human desk near the back of the chamber and listened to the word containment spoken 39 times. He was the only human in the room. Humanity had been a conclave member for less than 60 years. Most of the older species still mixed up human names. Dex had learned not to take it personally. When the clerk reached his station, Dex pressed the button for descent. A small orange light appeared next to the word human on the main board. Every other light on the board was blue. Nobody laughed. That would have been beneath the dignity of the chamber. But 2 of the Vrathani delegates exchanged a look that said the same thing a laugh would have said. Voss leaned slightly toward his speaking crystal. The motion carries. Containment Protocol 7 is now in effect. All vessels are prohibited from entering or approaching the Drahari star system. Violations will be treated as an act of deliberate interference with conclave emergency law. He paused. The single dissent from the human delegation is noted and recorded. Dex stood up. It was not his turn to speak. He spoke anyway. I want to confirm, for the record, that there are still approximately 300 million Drahari alive inside that system right now. Voss looked at him the way a much older person looks at someone who has said something technically accurate but deeply beside the point. That is correct. And the protocol forbids any vessel from bringing them food, medicine, or any form of assistance. The protocol is designed to prevent the spread of a synthetic pathogen that has already killed 2.7 billion people in 3 weeks. The risk calculus is, I understand the risk calculus, Dex said. I just wanted it stated plainly. Thank you. He sat down. The session continued. Dex spent the next 4 hours watching procedural motions pass and sending short messages to a ship that was already moving. The UES Unyielding was a medical research vessel. It was not a warship. It had no weapons worth nomming, and its hull plating was built for deep space endurance, not confrontation. Its crew of 212 included xenobiologists, engineers, field medics, 2 journalists who had hitched a ride under a research access clause, and 1 captain named Ren Devar who had received the containment order, read it fully, and then asked his navigator for an updated course to the Drafari system. The navigator had asked if he was sure. Ren had said yes. The navigator had set the course. That was the thing about humans that other species in the conclave had not yet fully learned. When they were told something was over, they checked for themselves. When they were told a situation was hopeless, they went and looked at it. Not because they were arrogant, not because they thought they were better than the species who voted blue, but because somewhere deep in the architecture of how humans were built, the word finished never quite landed the same way it landed for everyone else. Dr. Adara Solis was in her lab on the Unyielding when the ship changed course. She felt it in the slight shift of the engine hum. She had been studying the pathogen data that had leaked out of the Drahvari system before communications went dark. What she found in that data was strange. The plague was not natural. The structural geometry of its core delivery mechanism was too clean, too deliberately shaped. Nature did not make things this efficient at killing. Something had designed it. She filed the note in her research log and kept working. In Meridian Station, Dex was being approached by a Vrathani aide who politely informed him that the human vote had been a formality, and that Earth's continued cooperation with conclave protocols would be appreciated. Dex smiled and said he would pass that along. He sent another message to the Unyielding. It contained 3 words: do not stop. 2 hours later, the Unyielding crossed the quarantine marker. Every sensor buoy along the line logged the violation simultaneously and sent alerts cascading back to Meridian Station. Voss received the notification during a dinner that had been considered important. He set down his utensil. He read the ship name twice. A human vessel. One human vessel unarmed, crewed by doctors and engineers, heading into a dying system in defiance of a conclave-wide emergency law. His aide asked what he would like to do. Voss said to send the enforcement cruiser. His aide asked which tone the message to Earth should take. Voss thought about it. He said, disappointed. On bridge of the Unyielding, nobody made speeches. Wren looked at the quarantine marker falling behind them on the rear display. Someone in the back of the bridge quietly said, "Well, that is that." Someone else said, "Yep." Then they all went back to their stations, and the ship moved forward into the dark and the silence of a system the rest of the galaxy had decided to stop caring about. Adara was still in her lab. She had not looked up from her work in 3 hours. The pathogen data was showing her something she did not yet have words for. She wrote, "Engineered, confirmed." Then she underlined it. Outside the lab window, the stars of the Dravari system were getting closer. The first thing the unyielding sensors picked up was the silence. Not the silence of empty space, the silence of a planet that had lost too many of the things that make noise. Dravari Prime was a world of tall, curved cities and deep river systems. From orbit, it looked almost fine. Then the thermal scanners ran, and Adara saw the numbers. Power output across the entire northern continent was down to 11% of normal. The southern grid had collapsed entirely. Water treatment facilities were running on backup loops that would fail within a month. 300 million people alive, and the infrastructure built for 3 billion was falling apart around them. Wren called the ship to stations and took the Unyielding into low orbit. He kept the hull cameras running on wide angle. He wanted his crew to see what they had come for. The first shuttle down carried Adara, 6 medics, an engineer named Yale Oren, and 2 security staff who were mostly there to carry equipment. They wore full biological containment suits, sealed and filtered. The shuttle landed in the outer plaza of city called Varthun. The plaza had once held markets. Now it held the quiet kind of emptiness that comes after something large has ended. 3 Drahari met them at the edge of the plaza. They were tall, gray-skinned, with wide, flat eyes that caught light differently than human eyes. They wore no weapons. They stood in a line, and they did not move when the shuttle landed. The one in the center was old. His name was Shal. He had spent 12 years as his species' liaison to the Galactic Conclave before the plague made that job meaningless. He had watched the containment vote come through on a dying communications relay. He had seen 39 blue lights and 1 orange one, and it sat very still for a long time afterward. He spoke first. His words were run through the shuttle's translation unit. "You are human." Adara said, "Yes." The conclave voted to seal us in. They did. Shal looked at her for a moment. And yet, Adara agreed. He did not smile. Drahari faces were not built for human-style smiling, and Shal was not in the mood anyway. But something in his posture changed slightly. Not warmth, not yet. Just the smallest reduction in the distance between suspicion and waiting. He told them that the water reclamation facility for the eastern quarter of Varthun had been failing for 6 days. The Drahari engineers who knew how to fix it were dead. There were survivors who were trying, but they did not have the knowledge, and people were drinking from the river now and getting sick from that on top of everything else. Yale asked to see the facility. He was already pulling up schematics on his wrist unit as he talked. Shal looked at him the way people look at someone who has started solving a problem before they were technically invited to. He pointed toward the Eastern District, and Yale started walking. Adara spent the next 3 hours in the medical shelter that the survivors of Varthun had set up in what used to be a civic hall. The things she saw there, she wrote down carefully and professionally, and did not let herself feel fully until much later. The Dravari were a species that had been thriving 2 months ago. Now they were keeping each other alive with supplies meant to last weeks, and a collective kind of grief that did not have a name in any human language she knew. She treated what she could treat. She asked questions when it was appropriate. She listened more than she spoke. Back on the Unyielding, Ren received the first formal communication from the Vrithani enforcement cruiser, which had arrived at the quarantine boundary 3 hours behind them. The cruiser's commander, a tall officer named Ross, sent a recorded message stating that the Unyielding was in violation of Conclave Protocol 7 and must withdraw immediately. Ren recorded a response. He said, "There are 300 million people here, and my medical team is currently treating them." He said, "I understand your position." He said, "We will still be here tomorrow." He sent the response and went back to work. In the water reclamation facility, Yale had found the problem inside the first 20 minutes. A critical pressure relay had fused. The backup system had a different kind of fault. He did not have the exact parts. He looked at what the facility had, looked at what he had brought, and started thinking in the way that engineers think when the correct answer is not available and an approximate answer will have to do. He called up to the Unyielding and asked for 2 specific components from the ship's secondary coolant system. Someone up there did the math on what removing those components would mean for the ship's long-range capability. Then the components were loaded onto a supply drone and sent down anyway. Yale worked through the night. A Jadavari engineer named Oreth worked beside him, following instructions passed through a translation device that lagged by about 3 seconds. By morning, the eastern quarter of Varthun had clean running water again. Oreth looked at the water flowing through the restored pipes, and then looked at Yale. He said something the translator rendered as, "I did not know your kind could do this." Yale said, "We are very annoying that way." Shall heard about the water from one of the younger survivors. He stood for a moment. He said nothing. He went to find Adara. Shall found Adara in the civic hall washing her hands at a basin that had water again because of a human who had worked through the night on someone else's broken pipes. He stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself, watching her. She was making notes on a small hand device. She had dark circles under her eyes, and she was humming something quietly, some shapeless tune with no particular melody. He had expected humans to be loud. Everything he had heard about them in his years at the Conclave suggested a species that announced itself. But this one was just standing there doing her work, humming to herself like the world outside was a normal place. He stepped in. She looked up. He asked her directly, the way Jadavari spoke when they were being serious, "Why did you come? Your conclave has laws. You broke them." "Why?" Adara thought about it. She said, "Because you were here and you were dying, and the answer everyone else accepted did not feel like the right answer to us." Shaw considered that. "That is not a reason. That is a feeling." "Yes," she said. "We tend to act on those." He did not know what to do with that answer, so he moved past it. He told her there were 11 settlements beyond Varthun that they had lost contact with. Some were still broadcasting on low-power signals. Some had gone quiet. He wanted to know if the humans could reach them. Adara said they would try. That evening, Ren received the second message from the Vrithani cruiser commander Rost. This one was shorter. It said that a formal interdiction order had been filed with the Conclave and that the Unyielding was to hold its current position and prepare for escort out of the system. The message had a tone that was not quite a threat, and not quite a warning. It sat in the space between. Ren thought about it for approximately 40 seconds. Then he moved the Unyielding into a lower orbit, directly between the cruiser's projected approach vector and the planet's surface. It was not an aggressive maneuver. It was a mathematical one. If Rost wanted to move the Unyielding, he would have to do it. While every sensor in the system watched a Conclave warship physically remove a human medical crew from an active rescue operation. Rost held his position. Wren sent a short note to Dex Harrow at Meridian Station. It said, "Still here." Dex was in the middle of his third hearing in 2 days. Species representatives kept summoning him to rooms and asking him to explain humanity's behavior. He kept explaining it in the same way each time, with the calm of a man who understood that the goal was not to win the argument, but to make the argument last long enough to matter. In one of those hearings, a delegate from a mid-tier species called the Chirath said something that Dex had not expected. She said, "We have been reviewing the pathogen data that your vessel transmitted. There are anomalies that concern us." Dex kept his expression neutral. He asked what kind of anomalies. The Chirath delegate said, "The kind that suggests the plague was not an accident of nature." Dex said he would note that and follow up. He left the room and immediately sent a message to Adara. He asked her to confirm privately whether her findings supported what the Chirath had said. Adara replied within the hour. She sent him 3 lines of analysis and a structural diagram. Then she wrote, "Yes, confirmed. Engineered delivery system, not natural." Dex sat with that for a long time. Then he wrote back, "Document everything. Back it all up to Earth servers directly. Do not wait for my approval." On the surface, something unexpected happened during a routine supply distribution in the northern quarter of Varthon. A group of human medics had been handing out food and medicine packs. A Drafari woman asked, through a translator, why humans used 2 hands for everything. One of the medics explained that human hands were built that way, 2 arms, bilateral symmetry. The woman seemed genuinely fascinated. She said the Drafari also had 2 arms, but had always considered it a design limitation. The medic said humans had spent a remarkable amount of history being very creative about that limitation. The woman made a sound the translator described as amusement. It was the first recorded instance of a Dravari laughing in 5 weeks. Shall heard about it secondhand. He filed it away without comment. That night, back in her small workspace on the Unyielding, Adara pulled up the pathogen file again. The delivery mechanism had a structural signature that kept catching her eye. Something about its geometric efficiency felt familiar in a way she could not yet name. She cross-referenced it against 30 years of Conclave biological research archives. She got no match. She cross-referenced it against black market biosynthesis records that Earth intelligence had quietly provided to the research team before departure. She got a partial match. It was not a confirmation, but it pointed somewhere. It pointed toward a lab that had financial connections to interests she did not want to name yet. She saved the file. She backed it up to Earth. Then she stared at the ceiling of her workspace for a while. Outside, the Vrathani cruiser was still sitting at its position. Wren was still between it and the planet. Dex was still in rooms talking to people. Yale was already on a shuttle heading to the second settlement. Shal had flagged with a bag full of parts and a translation unit and no plan beyond getting there and seeing what was broken. The galaxy had voted to let this world go quiet. Nobody on the Unyielding was good at quiet. The settlement of Durvareth was 6 hours south of Arthon by shuttle, deep in a river valley where the tall grass had grown over the roads because no one had been left to cut it. Yale landed on a flat patch of open ground and walked into the settlement with his bag of tools and his translator unit and found 37 survivors living in a building that had been a school. They were not hostile. They were too tired for that. A young Dravari, barely an adult by the look of him, met Yale at the door and stared at the human for a long moment, and then said, in careful, translated words, "You are the ones who stayed." Yale said, "Yes." The young Dravari said, "We heard there was one orange light." Yale said, "That was us." Something in the young Dravari's face settled. He stepped back and opened the door wider. Durvarath had a food storage unit with a broken thermal regulator. It had been 3 days since they could properly preserve anything. Yale fixed it in 2 hours. Then he found a broken communications relay on the roof that had been preventing the settlement from reaching Varhoon. He fixed that too. Then he found a water filter that had been running at partial capacity and found a way to increase it using a component he repurposed from the shuttle's secondary ventilation unit, which would mean a slightly warmer shuttle ride back, but which also meant Dur Varath would have clean water at full capacity by morning. While he worked, the young Dravari, whose name translated roughly as Pell, stayed beside him and watched everything, and asked questions through the translator. Not about the repairs, about humans. He asked why the conclave did not stop the unyielding. Yale said they were trying. Pell asked why they had not succeeded. Yale said, "Because stopping us requires physically removing us, and that would look bad, and the conclave cares very much about how things look." Pell said, "Your people are very strange." Yale said, "We are aware." Back aboard the Unyielding, Adara completed her cross-reference analysis. The partial match in the black market records was not a full confirmation, but it was specific enough to narrow the origin of the pathogen's delivery mechanism to 3 possible sources, and 2 of those 3 had documented financial links to Verthani-controlled research interests. Not the Verthani government, not Voss personally, but close enough that the gap between those things and the truth was a gap that an investigation could close. She brought her findings to Wren. He read through them twice. He said, "If you are right, this was not a disaster. This was an action." Adara said, "I know." Wren looked out the viewport for a moment. "How certain are you?" She said, "Certain enough to send to Dex, not certain enough to say publicly." He told her to send it. She already had. Dex received the findings late at night by Meridian Station time. He read them 3 times. He made a cup of something warm and sat with it cooling in his hand while he thought. Then he drafted a formal request for a conclave investigative committee to examine the origins of the Dravari plague. He routed it through the 2 delegates he had been building careful alliances with over the past weeks. The Chirath delegate who had raised concerns earlier, and a quiet, thoughtful representative from a species called the Marath who had voted for containment, but had since been asking questions in hallways. He filed the request at a time when Verthani staff were not yet in their offices. He made sure the filing was public record before anyone had a chance to intercept it. By the time Voss's office contacted him to express concern about the request, it had already been read by delegates from 11 species. Voss blocked it procedurally. He had the authority, and he used it. But blocking a request and erasing the fact that it was filed were 2 different things, and Dex made sure every junior delegate in Meridian Station knew that the request existed, and knew that it had been blocked, and knew who had blocked it. On the surface, Shal gathered the surviving community leaders of Varthon. He stood at the front of the civic hall where Adara's team had treated hundreds of patients, and he spoke to his people for the first time since the plague had begun. He did not give a speech about survival or strength. He did not make promises he could not keep. He spoke plainly. He said, "The world we had is gone." He said, "The people we lost are not coming back." He said, "But there are 300 million of us still breathing, and there are humans on this planet who came here when the rest of the galaxy locked the door, and we are going to stand up and work alongside them because sitting down and waiting to die is a choice we are not going to make." Nobody cheered. Dravari did not cheer the same way humans did, but they stood. All of them stood, and they went to work. Adara watched the feed from a surface relay unit. She understood maybe 1 word in 10 of what Shal had said. She did not need to understand more than that. She went back to her lab and kept working. The Rathani enforcement cruiser made its move on a Tuesday by ship time, though nobody aboard the Unyielding had been keeping very careful track of days. It was not a weapons lock. It was a technical action. Commander Rost filed an emergency communication injunction through Conclave Relay Law, a procedural mechanism designed for extreme situations that allowed a senior enforcement vessel to freeze another ship's official conclave broadcast frequencies. Within 4 minutes of the filing, the Unyielding could no longer transmit or receive on any official conclave channel. Formally, they were cut off. Wren read the notification. He walked to engineering. He said, "Yale." Yale looked up from a workbench covered in Dravari relay components he had been reverse engineering for 3 days. He said, "I already know." Wren said, "Can you work around it?" Yale said, "I can do better than that." He spent 40 minutes building something that should not technically have worked, and then absolutely did work. He rooted the Unyielding's full research, archive, every file Adara had produced, every data log, every cross-referenced analysis of the synthetic pathogen, the partial source matches, the financial linkage summaries, all of it, through 17 civilian relay frequencies across the conclave network simultaneously. Not official channels, civilian ones, the kind used for personal communications, trade messages, news feeds, and public broadcasts. The data hit 23 star systems in under 6 minutes. It could not be recalled. It could not be blocked. It could not be made to not exist. The injunction covered official channels. The civilian network was not covered. Yale had read the injunction filing very carefully during those 40 minutes and had noticed that gap with the quiet, focused pleasure of a man who had spent his whole life finding gaps. Adara was in the medical shelter in Varthun when her wrist unit lit up with the notification that the broadcast had gone out. She stared at it for a moment. She thought about everything those files contained. The pathogen analysis, the delivery mechanism, the source traces, the partial matches. Then she went back to treating patients because that was what she had come here to do. And it was not finished. Aboard the Vrethani cruiser, Commander Rost received a message from Voss that was short and carried a tone Rost had never heard from Voss before. He read it twice. He understood that something had changed that could not be unchanged. At Meridian Station, Dex was in a corridor outside a council room when the data started spreading. Delegates' communication units began alerting one by one. A Marath aide rushed past him holding a data tablet and looking alarmed. 2 Tyreth officials passed in the opposite direction, talking in fast, low voices. Dex stood still in the middle of all of it with his hands in his pockets and let it happen around him. An aide from his own office appeared at his elbow and asked what he wanted to do. He said, "Nothing. Just watch." Inside the council room, Voss convened an emergency closed session. For the first time in the 11 years Dex had been a conclave delegate, he heard raised voices coming through the sealed chamber doors. Not one voice, several. Species that had been quiet and procedural for decades were suddenly asking questions that could not be procedurally deflected because the information was no longer inside a filing that could be blocked. It was in the open network. It was being read by people on 40 worlds. 2 days later, 2 more Earth vessels arrived at the quarantine boundary. They had supplies, additional medical, personnel, and 8 journalists from 4 different human news networks, all of whom had been briefed on the situation and all of whom had active broadcast credentials on the civilian relay network. They announced their arrival publicly. They stated they were joining a humanitarian operation. They asked, on record, for any species wishing to provide additional aid to contact the Unyielding directly. The quarantine enforcement cruiser did not move to intercept them. That same evening, Adara and Shal sat outside the medical shelter on a low wall that overlooked the dark streets of Varthun. The power was still partial in this district. About half the lights worked. It looked, Adara thought, like a city that was still deciding whether to come back. Shal said, without any particular lead-up, "Before all of this, I thought your species was minor, inexperienced, the sort that the older powers allow in out of courtesy." Adara said, "Most of the galaxy agrees with you." Shal said, "I think the galaxy is, measuring the wrong things. She asked what he meant. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Experience teaches caution. Your species has not yet learned what to be cautious about, so you simply do the thing that seems correct, and let the caution follow behind later." Adara thought about that. She said, "That is a generous way to describe being reckless." Shal made a sound that the translator did not convert, which meant it was probably something that did not have a human equivalent. She decided it was the Dravhari version of a complicated agreement. They sat there for a while longer. Above them, the unyielding was a small light moving across the sky. Beside it, almost invisible at this distance, the Vrathani cruiser had shifted position. It was no longer blocking the approach lane. It was just sitting there, holding station, waiting for instructions that were taking a very long time to come. Adara watched the lights move and said nothing, and thought about the pathogen files and the source matches, and what was going to happen when someone with real authority finally looked at them carefully. She thought it was going to be very interesting. The investigation took 8 months. Adara's analysis had been thorough enough that 3 independent conclave research teams reached the same conclusions within weeks. The delivery mechanism of the plague matched components traced to a private biosynthesis network. That network had financial backing from a holding group. That holding group had links to a Vrathani commercial interest. The chain was long, but it was unbroken, and by the 4th month, the chain had names attached to it. Voss resigned from his post on a quiet morning before the formal findings were published. He issued a statement expressing no admission of involvement and no apology, saying only that he was stepping down to allow the conclave to proceed without distraction. Dex Harrow read the resignation statement in his office at Meridian Station and then filed it in a folder and moved on to the next item of work. He had learned that partial accountability was still accountability. On Drev Hari Prime, the quarantine was formally lifted on a cold, dry morning at the start of what passed for winter on that world. There was no ceremony. A conclave relay station broadcast the official notice, and the sensor buoys along the quarantine line went dark. And that was that. The seal was gone. Shall receive the notification on a surface communications unit in the same civic hall where Adara's team had first set up their medical shelter. He read it once. He set the unit down. He went to find the surviving community leaders because there was a great deal of work to discuss. The rebuilding was not fast. It was not clean. It did not look like the kind of thing that gets recorded as a triumph. It looked like people getting up very early and working very late and making slow, exhausting progress through problems that seemed to generate new problems as fast as they solved the old ones. The Dravhari were not a species that had ever needed help on this scale, and they were not comfortable with the shape of it. Some of them resented it. Some of them were grateful and hated feeling grateful. Chael spent as much time managing those feelings within his own people as he spent on anything else. But the lights came on. One district at a time, one settlement at a time. The water ran clean. The food network started working again. The schools reopened 6 months after the quarantine lifted, with a student population that was a fraction of what it had been, and teachers who were still grieving the students they had lost, but they opened. Chael spent 4 of those months on the ground before the Unyielding was recalled to Earth for refit. He had trained 17 Dravhari engineers well enough that they could maintain what he had built and continue what he had started. On his last day on the surface, he gave his favorite set of calibration tools to Orath, the engineer who had worked beside him the first night in the water facility. Orath gave him a piece of carved stone from an old Dravhari tradition that Chael did not fully understand, but which he put in his breast pocket and kept there for the rest of his life. Adara stayed. She accepted a position on the permanent research post that Earth established in Varthun and continued her analysis of the pathogen. this time working directly alongside Dravhari biologists who were rebuilding their own research program from almost nothing. The collaboration produced, within 2 years, a detection method for synthetic pathogens of this type that was eventually adopted as a conclave-wide standard. The paper listed a Dara and a Dravari biologist named Kerr as co-authors. Wren took the unyielding home. On the bridge, during the long transit back, he sat in his chair and read reports and drank bad coffee and said very little. He did not give a speech to the crew when they crossed back over the quarantine line, now deactivated. Someone asked if he wanted to mark the moment somehow. He said no. He said they had done the work, and the work spoke for itself, and speeches were for people who needed the words to make it real. The crew respected that. Some of them wept privately, most of them just kept working. Shaw was elected to the reformed Dravhari seat on the Galactic Conclave 11 months after the quarantine lifted. His acceptance address was 32 minutes long, delivered in Dravhari with a simultaneous translation running on all official channels. He spoke about loss. He spoke about the structure of a species when most of it is gone. He spoke about what it means to rebuild, not the thing that was, but something new, that knows what it survived. Near the end, he said one sentence that the official translation rendered as, "We did not endure because we were strong. We endured because at the moment we were most alone, one door in the galaxy opened instead of closed." He did not name the species. He did not need to. Every delegate in the chamber who had cast a blue vote on the morning of Protocol 7 heard those words and knew exactly which door he meant. Dex Harrow, sitting at the human desk near the back of the chamber, listened to the sentence and looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up and paid attention to the rest of the speech. Outside, the stars were the same stars they had always been. They did not know or care what had happened beneath them, but the people who moved between them were in some small, permanent way different. Not better, not worse, just changed the way anything is changed by a weight it chose not to put down.